I'm going to say something perhaps a little shocking now, perhaps to some of you, and it's this. The Bible contains rather a lot of racism. This should not surprise us. The scriptures we have inherited from our ancestors inevitably reflect the mindset of the people who wrote them. In particular, the Jews believed that they were the chosen people, a special people who were set apart from all other nations, through which the salvation of all humanity would come. And of course, in a sense, this was true and turned out to be true, for Jesus was a Jew, and therefore through him, salvation for all the world did indeed come through the Jews. But this truth bred some pretty uncomfortable attitudes and ideas in the minds of certain Jewish leaders over the centuries. Despite all the awful things that happened to them as a people, all the conquests and defeats, all the carrying off into exile, they felt a deep sense of being super special, extra special people to God. And for some leaders, that special status drove them to believe that they were in some sense superior to other nations. They were the nation through whom God had chosen to reveal himself to humanity after all. Didn't that make them superior? And therefore, of course, other nations were just not as special. They were less than the Jewish people, inferior, or so some leaders believed. And crucially, they believed that the Jewish nation must remain pure. A very good example of this mindset is found in the books of Nehemiah and Ezra. If you've never read them, I recommend them to you. They're quite a rollicking good read. They're not as difficult to access as many other Old Testament books because they're set out as stories, the story of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. After returning from 70 years in exile in Babylon, Nehemiah, who was a kind of governor appointed over Jerusalem by the Babylonians, rebuilt the walls and the temple of Jerusalem. Many of the common people of Israel had not gone into exile. It was only the leaders, the bigwigs, who got carried off. It was the bigwigs who sat down by the rivers of Babylon and wept. The common people, well, they stayed behind and carried on their lives as best they could under Babylonian rule. But after rebuilding the walls and the temple, the high priest Ezra, also newly returned to Jerusalem, stood up to pronounce to the common people that God now commanded them to separate themselves entirely from the nations around them. He sharply condemned them for having, quote, mingled the holy race with the peoples around them. Men who had married Canaanite women, for example, were commanded to divorce them and send them away. But it's important to understand that not all leaders believed that this was what God wanted. Whilst Nehemiah and Ezra were battling for racial purity, many like Isaiah and Jeremiah argued that their special status was not a calling to domination and racial purity, but rather a calling to servanthood. The famous picture of the suffering servant in Isaiah is a key passage. It encouraged the Jewish people to see themselves as servants to all humanity, and to be prepared even to die sacrificially in the attempt. Jesus, of course, embodied that idea, which is why the suffering servant passages are often seen, especially by Christians, as a foretelling of his story. And in this morning's reading from Isaiah that Ian gave to us just now, we hear a call for all foreigners to be welcomed into the house of faith. These foreigners, says Yahweh, will I bring into my holy mountain and make them joyful in the house of prayer. Jeremiah had a similar vision in which the people of all nations would come up to the holy mountain of God. And so you see, racism was as much a live issue for the people of Bible times as it remains for us today. Its pages, the Bible's pages, are full of the clash of civilizations, competing endlessly with each other for dominance, and of course always claiming that their God was on their side. There have always been people who consider themselves essentially superior to everyone else just by virtue of their race. It's part of fallen humanity's nature to look down on and to ridicule and to fear the other. And it was this inbuilt racism that Jesus highlighted when he spoke sharply to the Canaanite woman who was seeking healing for her child. We find Jesus in the story that we just heard from the Gospel, ministering in a foreign part of the area in which he lived. Canaanites, a conquered people, lived there. Jesus has clearly chosen to expand his ministry beyond Jerusalem and Nazareth and Galilee, right out to the outer margins and into the heartland of foreigners. And when one of them asks for his help, he sees, I think, an opportunity to prick at what he knew all Jews of the time would probably be thinking. He clearly senses, or divinely knows, that this woman is someone with the capacity to teach all the Jews gathered around him. So he fences words with her. It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. In other words, he boldly states that his mission is surely only for the children of Israel, not to the dogs of other nations. But this woman has courage and a quick intelligence. Ah, she replies, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs from their master's table. I like to visualize Jesus laughing out loud at that reply. Yeah, this is what he needs. Someone who can show by their wit, intelligence, and faith that they're just as good as any Jew, just as deserving of God's love. And that fits entirely with the rest of his teaching. The parable of the Good Samaritan, his encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus wants the whole world, every nation and tongue, to know of God's love. And that's what he commands all his disciples to do, to go, to tell in the great commandment at the end of his time on earth. Go, he tells them, and make disciples of all nations. And this is what he commands us to do too. There's no room for racism in Christianity. No nation is superior to another, whatever great things some of their individual people have achieved. God's love cries out to every nation and every